Have you ever looked at something a government is doing and just thought to yourself, wait, that makes absolutely no sense? You've got these moves that seem to completely contradict each other, and it leaves everybody just scratching their heads. Well, today, we're going to dive into one of the biggest political puzzles of the Trump administration. It's a story about Venezuela, where the official story and what was actually happening, well, they were worlds apart.
So it all kicks off with this one question that just sends shockwaves everywhere. Is the United States secretly getting ready for a war? And look, this wasn't just some wild media speculation. It was sparked by this huge, sudden military operation in the Caribbean that kind of came out of nowhere. The question on everyone's mind was simple. What was really going on?
All right, so it all starts with this really dramatic show of force right off the coast of Venezuela. And we're not talking about some routine patrol here. This was something on a completely different level. Just to put this in perspective for you, this was the largest U.S. military deployment in the Caribbean in decades. I mean, a naval presence this big is usually what you see right before a major conflict. But the administration's official reason for it all? It was surprisingly small. Suspiciously small, even. And then came this incredibly aggressive move. The White House just announces that the airspace over Venezuela is, quote, closed in its entirety. Now, as you can imagine, Venezuela did not take this sitting down. They immediately called it an illegal and unjustified aggression. The stage was set for a major showdown. So you've got warships on the move, you've got airspace declared closed. What was the official reason for this historic military operation? Well, they framed it as a crackdown on crime. The White House comes out and says this entire massive buildup was all part of a campaign aimed specifically at disrupting drug cartels, a targeted anti-drug mission. But the facts that started to come out pretty quickly told a very different and much darker story. And here is the human cost. More than 80 people killed in over 20 boat strikes that were part of this so-called campaign. That is a staggering number. And once reporters started digging into who these victims actually were, the official narrative really started to unravel. And what's crucial here is that the people killed, they weren't cartel kingpins. They were described as low-level mules, a lot of them just ordinary people being paid to transport something. They were killed at sea with no trial, no due process. And that raised some really serious questions on Capitol Hill about whether these strikes were violating the rules of armed conflict, the international laws that govern warfare. So here's the kicker. Let's just say for a second that you take the administration at its word, that this was a fierce, all-out war on drugs. Okay, well, a move they made almost at the exact same time makes that entire story just completely fall apart. While one arm of the administration was waging this deadly campaign at sea, another arm was signing off on a presidential pardon that seemed to totally undermine the mission's entire stated purpose. And here it is, the core contradiction. On one hand, you have this massive, lethal military operation against drug trafficking. And on the other, a presidential pardon for a high-profile convicted drug trafficker. It is a stunning disconnect that it doesn't add up. And listen, this wasn't some minor player. This was Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras. He was convicted in a U.S. court and sentenced to 45 years in prison. But here's the real kicker. Prosecutors specifically said that Hernandez allowed cocaine from Venezuela, the very country the military was targeting, to flow right into the United States. The New York Times didn't pull any punches. They called it a remarkable dissonance. It was a policy so contradictory that it left even seasoned political experts just struggling to figure out what the strategy was supposed to be. So you have to wonder, right? Was this just a one-off, a weird contradiction that was only happening with Venezuela? Or was it part of a broader pattern of policymaking where the reason they gave and the thing they did just didn't line up? Well, let's take a look at another huge policy area for the administration, immigration. Because here we see the exact same pattern, a single tragic event used to justify this sweeping and seemingly disconnected policy response. The trigger was this awful tragedy, the shooting of 2 National Guard members. The suspect was an Afghan national who was actually in the country legally. The administration then used this one single event as the justification for a massive overhaul of immigration rules. But just look at their response. It went so far beyond dealing with the specifics of that one incident.
halting all asylum decisions, period, pausing visas for an entire country, stopping migration from huge regions of the world. It's just like with Venezuela. These are massive actions that seem completely out of proportion to the stated reason. It's a clear echo of that same strategic disconnect.
Now, all this ambiguity, all these contradictions, they didn't go unnoticed. Both the American public and their elected officials in Washington started demanding some clarity.
The administration totally failed to sell its Venezuela strategy to the American people. Polling showed this overwhelming opposition to a potential war, a massive 70% against it. There was just no public appetite for a conflict that hadn't been clearly explained. And it was the exact same story with immigration. On an issue that was supposed to be a political slam dunk for them, a strong majority of Americans disapproved. That includes nearly 70% of those crucial independent voters. The extreme measures, well, they just weren't resonating.
This right here is maybe the most telling sign of just how confusing things were. It wasn't just the other party asking questions. Republican and Democratic leaders on the powerful armed services committees actually teamed up to demand answers. That's a rare show of bipartisan unity, and it was driven by genuine concern.
And so, you're left with all of these questions just hanging in the air. What was the real goal? Why would you pardon a major trafficker in the middle of a supposed drug war? And really, the fundamental questions so many people were asking, why Venezuela? Why now? And why do it this way? The lack of clear answers just created this vacuum filled with confusion and suspicion.
It all leaves us with one final, crucial question to think about. When there's this giant gap between what a government says it's doing and what it actually does, what's left behind is public doubt and a desperate search for the real story.